G'day mate, 40 here. So one thing that distinguishes my approach from other pro-Trump pundits is that I have very little desire for vengeance and I have very little resentment against the left. So resentment against the left seems to be a driving force for Donald Trump, right? He feels like he's been wronged and he wants retribution, and his most intense, passionate followers have the same attitude. And I don't have that attitude because I don't tend to have a life filled with resentment to begin with. So I don't believe that resentment is good for me. It certainly comes up at times. It can build and take me over. But if you are spotting your resentment when it comes up and then you get to the underlying causes and you let it go, right, you're not going to be motivated primarily by resentment. So I think that people's political opinions are primarily shaped by their genetics and by their imprinting and by the social group that they belong to or aspire to belong to. And so people are swayed by social cues and incentives. And so I look at all these forces and I don't see a whole lot of room for free will when it comes to people's political attitudes. And therefore, I don't hold their politics against them. So people on the right probably have larger amygdalas, bigger fear response, right? They are more activated by threats. Their biggest fears are disorder and impurity. People on the left, their biggest fears are ignorance and bigotry. And right, there's indications that there are structural, anatomical, craniological, psychological, psychometric differences between people on the right and the left. And so if you internalize the power of genetics and the power of early imprinting and the power of social cues, incentives, of aspiration, what group do you want to belong to, what type of life do you want to live, and what type of crowd do you want to hang out with, and you put all those cues, throw them in together, and that's going to overwhelmingly shape people's political preferences. So I don't see any point about getting angry about the left, right? They are reacting to the same sort of genetics and social imprinting that people on the right are reacting to. And so when you recognize the power of all these forces outside of consciously chosen free will, it considerably reduces the incentive for retribution, for waging war against the left, for Donald Trump just to go all out and smash his enemies. Right? I just don't share that psychology. Hey, where am I from? I'm from Australia. What time is it here? It is 9 a.m. So I'm in Westwood, California. So I think you see the world a lot more clearly when you don't have resentment, right? You're better able to navigate your personal life, your love life, your relationships, your family, your career, your educational community, your politics, the world around you, the community around you, your religious community, when you're largely free from resentment. When you recognize that if you're in other people's shoes, that you had their genetics and their early social imprinting, that you'd probably act the same way. So I notice that resentment tends to make people behave badly. And I noticed Megyn Kelly and a lot of people on the right just fill themselves with disgust at Morning Joe, that Joe Scarborough and Mika Brzezinski, his co-host on their MSNBC show, had a meal with Donald Trump at Mar-a-Lago on Friday and looking to make amends and to open up communication. And people like Megyn Kelly say, where would Donald Trump give these people the time of day. They called him a fascist. They said he was like Hitler, danger to democracy. Well, under times of stress and intense competition, we often say hyperbolic things about our opponents. Donald Trump has been known to say hyperbolic things about his opponents. So I don't consider it cowardly, pusillanimous, disgusting, or anything that Morning Joe are trying to heal their relationship with Donald Trump. Right? As soon as you start to form any kind of relationship, right, you are inevitably setting the stage for a sense of betrayal. And when people feel betrayed, right, they tend to use hyperbolic language like betrayal. And betrayal is the intense term that we use when other people don't have the priorities that we expected them to have. So you may want to talk to a friend, and you call him and you leave a message and you text him and he doesn't call you back, and so you feel betrayed that you really need to talk to your friend and he's not there for you when you need him most. But he may simply have other priorities, right? He may have family members who are sick. He may be deep into a work project and he wants to place all of his attention on his work project. And so when you get disappointed that other people don't have the exact priorities that you thought they were going to have, right? You're going to use hyperbolic terms like betrayal, but it will inevitably crop up. Right? You can't form any kind of relationship with someone without inevitably feeling let down and disappointed that you don't occupy as a priority in their life as you wanted. And so under intense pressure, right, people will lash out. And that's happened with the relationship between Donald Trump and Joe Scarborough and Mika Brzezinski. And these kind of things are inevitable in tense relationships where there are substantial conflicts of interest. And so I think it's great that anyone in the position that Joe Scarborough and Mika Brzezinski find themselves in, that they try to make amends and try to reclaim open lines of communication. Now, in my life experience, when I've turned an enemy into a friend, that's been a friend for life. On the other hand, when I've had a close friend and that's ruptured substantially, it never seems to grow back to the same level of commitment and friendship that was there previously. So turn an enemy into a friend for life in my experience. Yeah, I'm a Donald Trump supporter. I am excited that Trump won the election. I want him to govern effectively and righteously, and that means you need to use discretion about when you wage war on your opponents. Sometimes it's much smarter to form an alliance, see where you can pursue common interests. Sometimes it's smarter to hold your fire. Sometimes you just let your enemy self-destruct. So right now, Democrats are principally arguing amongst themselves about who's to blame for the 2024 election. And often the smart thing to do is just allow the enemy to fight amongst itself. So no general just wages all-out war at all times, right? The winning general, the smart general, right, is selective about the land on which he wages battle. He is selective about which troops he keeps as reinforcements. He's selective about which troops he deploys where. He's selective about the time and the place, the setting of the battle. He recognizes that the battle is just one part of an overall strategy, and sometimes you can lose a battle and win the war. So, for example, George Washington, he lost pretty much every battle that he had with the British, but he had the incentive. He just had to survive. He just had to keep an army together in the field, and he was going to win out because he was playing on home turf. And so Donald Trump is a raid against the deep state, right? Federal employees would have donated to his opponent 20-1. And many of these federal employees have expertise that a Trump administration will need to run smoothly. Ronald Reagan was largely indifferent to his cabinet, to his chief of staff, to the aides around him. He never tried to go outside of them to get other opinions. He wasn't particularly interested in governance, except perhaps when it came to the Defense Department. And almost all his rhetoric about government employees was negative, which decreases morale in the federal workforce. He had all sorts of corruption scandals in his cabinet because I'm afraid, like Donald Trump, Ronald Reagan wasn't particularly interested in the nuances of governing. Like Donald Trump, Ronald Reagan was primarily interested in the performance of governing. And I wish that Donald Trump's team takes more of an interest in the nuts and bolts of governing, that they put a higher price on getting things done, on competence, on relevant expertise, increasing the quality of government-provided services, seeing if they can do it at a lower price, rather than just having disdain for everything the government does. It sucks, man. It's incompetent. Everything the government touches, it's never going to be as efficient as the private sector. That's not necessarily true. Right? There are a lot of government departments that do important work and get very little recognition. So Donald Trump, like Ronald Reagan, is all in on the performance of government. He's all in on the imaging, on staging rallies and spectacles, and looking presidential. But what I'm most concerned about is the competence level of his picks. And I don't think that Pete Hegseth, Matt Gaetz, who's the other one, Bobby Kennedy, high in expertise and high in competence. And I'm concerned that Donald Trump is not particularly devoted to competence and to the nuts and bolts of governing. I'm concerned that the Trump is primarily about the acting, the performance of putting on a show, rather than the more mundane task of providing high quality government services. So I'm all for retribution if it takes the form of disclosure, right? Bringing wrongdoing to light, revealing how predecessors have misused the powers of government, and making a presentation of documents and information that most Americans would agree on. Hey, this was an abuse of the government and its power, that federal prosecutors may have undue power. So let's bring things to light. If the retribution takes the form of bringing information to light and documents to light, so that people who have abused their power and who have broken the law are called to account, I'm all for that. But just this blind hatred of people who have a different hero system from you, who experience life differently from you, who have different moral and political priorities than you, and just an all-out desire to wound and to harm your enemies, that's just going to lead to a downward spiral. Because there's a time to fight and there's a time to love, right? There's a time to hug. There's a time to keep your distance. There's a time to compromise. And there's a time to stand up for what you believe in, even if it's unpopular. You have to use good judgment, right? There's no substitute for good judgment, clarity, precision, effectiveness, competence, like an appropriate strategy for the appropriate challenge. And when you're filled with a desire for retribution and revenge and resentment, it just clouds your vision. And the best analogy that I can think of is from Fred Luskin's book, Forgive for Good. He talks about a normal person like an air traffic controller, where let's say you've got 10 tasks to do that day. So it's the equivalent of having 10 planes that you want to land. But then when you have a desire for vengeance, retribution, when you're aggrieved and resentful, these are just unnecessary planes that you have circling around in your head. And it just makes the performance of your necessary tasks much more difficult. You're distracted. You're going to lack clarity. So land the planes of resentment. Just focus on your duty. And if your duty reveals wrongdoing by the other side, then reveal it. And most Americans will support you and they'll applaud you. And you will increase your goodwill and your approval ratings with the American people. But if you just go on a vendetta, if you just become an incredibly vindictive person who goes after your enemies without regard to whether or not it's in America's interests, then the American people will turn against you. The House and the Senate will go to the Democrats in the midterms, and the next elected president will be a Democrat if you engage in a downward spiral of resentment. How can a president not be an actor? Ronald Reagan. Luke paraphrases Ecclesiastes. Yes. Yeah, when I'm listening to the Audible, 32-hour Audible version of Max Boot's definitive Ronald Reagan biography, it's breathtaking how Reagan was not particularly interested in his cabinet, in the nuts and bolts of government. He didn't even know many of their names. He was not intellectually curious. He just had certain conservative columnists that he liked to read on a regular basis, such as George Will. And who's the other guy? James Kirkpatrick. So he was a longtime defender of segregation, but then switched to states' rights and more conventional conservative politics. So Ronald Reagan just loved to read Human Events and National Review. Those were his staples. But he never tried to get outside expertise aside from his advisors, or aside from his cabinet. And there wasn't much of an effort placed in his administration with getting effective, efficient, competent cabinet members. And it reminds me of Trump. What I see is a series of disastrous picks. Okay, I'll talk to you blokes later. Bye-bye.